Hey guys, tonight we walk with you through torchlit corridors where gold gleams softly against stone walls, and every reflected sparkle feels just a little bit watchful. You stand before a heavy mirror in a royal bedchamber, candle flames shivering as if they know something you don't, and on the velvet cushion below rests a piece of jewelry you're expected to wear. It's beautiful, ancient, impossibly expensive, and everyone in the room is pretending not to notice how your fingers hesitate. Somewhere between the silk curtains and the scent of beeswax, a quiet truth hums. You probably won't survive this in the way you imagine survival works. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You don't learn fear of royal jewels from proclamations or official histories. No one ever gathers the court and announces, "This necklace is bad luck. Please scream internally." Instead, you absorb it the way you absorb the cold of a stone palace, slowly, constantly, until you forget there was ever warmth. In the earliest courts of Europe and beyond, jewels were never just decoration. They were contracts, trophies, omens, and sometimes threats disguised as beauty. You feel this immediately because the way people look at a jewel is never quite the way they look at a chair or a gown. Their eyes linger, their voices lower. Someone inevitably says, "It has a history," and no one ever means a nice one. One mainstream historical fact anchors this fear early on. Royal jewels were often recycled across generations, reset and reworked, rather than newly made. Gold was melted, gems were removed from old settings and placed into new ones, carrying with them the reputations of previous owners. If a queen wore a ring during a disastrous reign, plagues, rebellions, inconvenient beheadings, that ring didn't forget, or at least people believed it didn't. And belief in a palace is more powerful than truth. You start to understand that when a lady-in-waiting adjusts a necklace and mutters a prayer under her breath, she's not being dramatic, she's being practical. There's a quirky tidbit historians love to mention at dinner parties. In some medieval courts, jewels were quietly tested on lesser nobles before being offered to the queen. If the wearer fell ill, suffered misfortune, or died suddenly, awkward, yes, but very informative, the piece might be discreetly retired. You can imagine how comforting that must have been, knowing your necklace had already ruined someone else's life and was therefore safe. Royal logic is a special kind of logic. The same logic that convinced people crocodile dung sunscreen was a good idea, which, remember that because we're coming back to it later. As you move through these early courts, you realize fear wasn't always framed as superstition. Often it was framed as wisdom. Queens were expected to be observant, cautious, attuned to unseen currents. Wearing the wrong jewel wasn't just unlucky, it was irresponsible. You feel the pressure of that expectation because your body is no longer just your own. Your health equals stability, your fertility equals national security. Your headaches are a potential constitutional crisis. So if a certain brooch is rumored to bring miscarriages or madness, you don't laugh it off. You quietly leave it in its box and pretend you simply prefer emeralds. Historians still argue whether these fears were rooted in genuine belief or strategic storytelling. Some suggest that labeling a jewel cursed was a convenient way to sideline politically dangerous pieces, gems associated with rival dynasties, foreign claims, or inconvenient inheritances. Others argue that in a world with no germ theory, no psychiatry, and very limited painkillers, humans reached for narrative explanations wherever they could. If 3 queens died young after wearing the same crown, the crown didn't need to actually be cursed to feel cursed. Your nervous system did the rest. You can almost feel how these stories spread. Whispered during hair braiding, exchanged during sleepless nights, passed from queen to daughter-in-law with a careful squeeze of the hand. That one, someone would say, barely moving their lips, never ends well. No written record, no official ban, just a collective agreement to be careful. And careful, in royal life, often meant fearful, with better posture. One of the earliest and most persistent anxieties centered on gold itself. Gold doesn't tarnish, it doesn't decay. It survives fires, floods, and regime changes. To modern ears, that sounds reassuring. To medieval minds, it sounded unnatural. Eternal substances made people uneasy, especially when paired with human fragility. You wear gold, but gold will outlive you. That imbalance alone felt dangerous. Add in the fact that gold often came from conquered lands, mined by exhausted bodies under brutal conditions, and suddenly the metal seemed soaked in suffering. Not metaphorically, emotionally. You feel it when you clasp it around your neck like borrowed weight. There's also the matter of visibility. Queens were seen constantly. Every appearance was scrutinized. Wearing a jewel linked to a disgraced predecessor could be read as arrogance, ignorance, or provocation. You might think you're just accessorizing, but half the court thinks you're making a statement about legitimacy, succession, or revenge. So fear creeps in from all sides. Fear of the jewel's past, fear of its message, fear of what happens if you're seen wearing it and something goes wrong afterward, because something always goes wrong eventually. Weather fails, a child falls ill, a treaty collapses, and suddenly everyone remembers the necklace. Here's where a light joke sneaks in, because we need one before this gets too heavy. Imagine being told, this necklace might doom your reign, but it really brings out your eyes. Royal beauty standards were ruthless like that. You laugh softly, but it's the kind of laugh you do into a pillow so no one hears. Another mainstream fact slips quietly into place. Coronation regalia was often considered more dangerous than everyday jewels. These pieces were worn at moments of transition. Crowning, marriage, childbirth announcements, times already loaded with anxiety. Humans are excellent at pattern making, especially under stress. If disaster followed ceremony, the objects involved took the blame. You start to see why some queens preferred simpler adornments during critical moments. Modesty wasn't humility, it was risk management. Fringe beliefs layered themselves on top of this practical fear. Certain stones were thought to wake up under specific conditions. Diamonds exposed to blood. Rubies heated by anger. Pearls reacting to tears. You don't need to believe these ideas for them to influence behavior. All it takes is one trusted voice saying, better not, for a jewel to become radioactive. And once a piece gains that reputation, it's almost impossible to cleanse. No amount of polishing fixes a story. Historians still argue whether these early jewel fears were gendered differently for queens than for kings. Kings wore cursed swords and armor all the time and called it bravery. Queens wore cursed necklaces and called it recklessness. You feel that double standard pressing in, subtle but constant. Your body is symbolic in a way a king's rarely is. When you suffer, it's read as meaning something. When you thrive, it's also read as meaning something. There's no neutral state. So, of course, you're careful about what touches your skin. As the section drifts toward its close, you notice how none of this fear is loud. There are no screaming bans, no dramatic refusals in public halls. It's all quiet choices. A jewel left unworn, a box never reopened, a tradition that fades without explanation. That's how royal fear survives, by becoming habit. You don't think, this is cursed. You think, this just isn't done. And somehow, that feels worse. You stand again before that mirror, candlelight steady now, the jewel still waiting. No one rushes you. No one pressures you. And that's the most unsettling part. The fear is already yours. You've inherited it just like the crown, just like the stories no one writes down. You don't sleep well once the crown enters your life, and not just because it's heavy or because someone is always outside your door, breathing like a very polite threat. You lie awake because the objects meant to symbolize your authority have started to feel strangely alert, as if they're waiting for something from you. The crown sits nearby, even when you're not wearing it, resting on its cushion like a creature that doesn't blink. You try turning your head away, but you still feel it there. That's when the stories start working on you, quietly, efficiently, like insomnia with a memory. There is a mainstream historical fact that keeps surfacing in court records and personal letters. Many queens complained of headaches, dizziness, and exhaustion after formal appearances involving heavy regalia. This wasn't imaginary. Medieval and early modern crowns could weigh several kilograms, pressing down on the skull for hours at a time. Combine that with tight hairstyles, fasting before ceremonies, and layers of fabric restricting movement, and you've got a recipe for genuine physical misery. But in a world without ergonomic consultants or ibuprofen, the discomfort didn't get labelled as poor design. It got labelled as a bad crown. You begin to notice patterns because everyone else already has. A queen wears a specific crown, falls ill shortly after, and never quite recovers. Another wears the same piece years later and suffers from what the court physician delicately calls melancholia, which is historical code for everything from depression to political burnout. Sleep becomes elusive. Nightmares creep in. The crown doesn't just sit on your head during the day anymore. It shows up in your dreams, pressing down, tilting, slipping, always threatening to fall at the worst possible moment. You wake up sweating, convinced it's a sign. Here's a quirky tidbit that rarely makes it into textbooks. Some courts believed certain crowns actively disrupted sleep even when not worn. They were thought to radiate unrest, especially if placed too close to the royal bed. In response, crowns were sometimes stored in separate chambers at night, guarded but distant, like volatile chemicals. You can imagine the logic. If a crown causes headaches by day, why wouldn't it cause nightmares by night? It's the same reasoning that convinced people mirrors could steal your soul if you slept facing them. Fear doesn't need peer review, it just needs repetition. Historians still argue whether queens genuinely believed crowns could affect their sleep, or whether sleeplessness simply amplified existing anxieties. The truth, inconveniently, is probably both. You're under constant surveillance. Your body is public property. Your smallest ailment is discussed by councils of men who have never worn anything heavier than their own confidence. So when sleep fails you, you search for a cause you can control. You can't control politics. You can't control childbirth. But you can control whether a particular crown sits near your pillow. Sleep deprivation does something subtle to your thinking. It sharpens superstition. When you're rested, a rumor is just a rumor. When you're exhausted, it feels like a warning. You replay conversations in your mind, the way someone hesitated before handing you the crown, the way another courtier crossed themselves afterward. These details swell in importance at 3 a.m. You don't dismiss them, you catalogue them. This is how fear becomes policy without ever being written down. There's also the matter of timing. Coronations, by design, follow moments of upheaval. Deaths, abdications, wars, revolutions of varying politeness. You're already emotionally raw when the crown is placed on your head. If your sleep collapses afterward, which it often does, the crown becomes an easy scapegoat. It's sitting right there, glittering, unapologetic. You don't blame grief or stress. You blame the thing that touched you last. Human brains love that shortcut. Let's slide in a light joke before this gets too oppressive. Imagine explaining to a court physician that you can't sleep because your crown is vibing incorrectly. He nods gravely, writes something in Latin, and prescribes leeches anyway. Problem solved, except not at all. One famous example often cited involves queens who insisted on lighter, alternative crowns for daily use, reserving the official ones for rare ceremonies. This wasn't always framed as comfort. It was framed as prudence. The heavy crown was said to be temperamental, demanding, or not fond of overuse, which is a very polite way of saying it made you feel like your skull was being punished for ambition. Over time, these preferences hardened into superstition. A crown worn too often was thought to resent it. A crown ignored too long was thought to sulk. Objects in these stories had feelings, and those feelings mattered. Sleep loss also blurred the line between physical sensation and symbolic meaning. A throbbing temple wasn't just a headache, it was a warning. A restless night wasn't just insomnia, it was a premonition. You start connecting dots that aren't there, but once connected, they refuse to disconnect. If you dream of falling while wearing a particular crown, you don't wear it again. You don't announce why. You just don't. And everyone notices. They always do. There's a broader scholarly debate here about whether queens' reported illnesses were exaggerated by later chroniclers to dramatize reigns. Historians still argue whether descriptions of crown-induced madness were literal beliefs or narrative tools used to explain political failures. But even if later writers embellished, the original fear didn't need embellishment. It lived in the body. It lived in the nights you stared at the ceiling, counting breaths, listening to the palace settle and creak like a giant animal. You begin to understand that fear of jewels isn't always about dramatic curses or sudden deaths. Sometimes it's about erosion, about what happens when an object slowly wears you down, night after night, until you associate its presence with the absence of rest. Sleep is vulnerability. Queens weren't allowed much of it. Anything that threatened what little they had became suspect. By now, you don't need anyone to tell you which crowns are bad sleepers. Your body knows. And in a life where intuition is one of the few tools you're allowed to trust, that knowledge carries weight. You move the crown farther from the bed. You sleep a little better, and just like that, the superstition proves itself. By now, you've learned that jewels don't just sit on the skin, they linger in the mind, and some linger more aggressively than others. These are the stones people say can remember. Not metaphorically, not poetically, but literally. You hear it in the way voices drop when certain gems are mentioned, in the way boxes are opened carefully, as if sound itself might wake something. You're told these stones have seen too much, and the unspoken ending of that sentence is always the same, and now they want to share it with you. There is a mainstream historical fact that grounds this fear in something solid. Many royal jewels were taken as spoils of war, stripped from defeated rulers, looted from temples, or seized during violent transitions of power. These weren't gifts exchanged with smiles and treaties. They were trophies pulled from chaos. You know this because the records say so. Lists of gems captured after battles, inventories updated after executions, crowns dismantled and redistributed when a dynasty fell. Violence clung to these objects not because they were magical, but because they were present. And presence over time starts to feel like participation. You're told, often quietly, that certain stones are heavy. Not physically heavy, that's a different problem, but emotionally dense. Rubies, in particular, develop a reputation for this. Their color doesn't help. Deep red stones are associated with blood almost everywhere, across cultures that never met each other, which is impressive in a deeply unsettling way. You wear one and someone inevitably says it looks powerful. Power, you've learned, is never a neutral compliment. it usually means dangerous. Here's a quirky tidbit that sounds like fiction but shows up repeatedly in fringe court law. Some queens believe gemstones could absorb emotional residue like sponges soaking up pain. A jewel worn during an execution, a betrayal, or a public humiliation was thought to store that moment inside itself. Later, when worn again, it might release that stored energy back into the body. Not all at once, nothing so cinematic, but gradually. Unease, irritability, sudden sadness with no clear source. The kind of feelings that don't announce where they came from, just that they're here now. Historians still argue whether this belief was influenced by early medical theories about humours and balance, or whether it was simply a psychological response to trauma. If you know a ring once circled the finger of a queen on the day her husband was murdered, wearing it yourself is going to feel strange no matter how rational you are. Your body reacts before your intellect can intervene. You feel it as a tightening in the chest, a reluctance you can't quite explain. And in court life, unexplained reluctance is taken very seriously. You start noticing that stones associated with bloodshed are often the ones quietly sidelined. They don't disappear, they're not destroyed. They're too valuable for that. Instead, they're reclassified, moved to ceremonial use only, displayed but not worn, kept for portraits rather than bodies. It's a compromise between belief and practicality. You acknowledge the fear without officially endorsing it, which is the most royal solution imaginable. There's also the matter of inheritance. When jewels pass from one queen to another, they don't arrive empty. They come wrapped in stories, some of which are conveniently omitted. You might be told this belonged to your predecessor, but not told which day it belonged to her. Was it worn at her wedding or at her trial? Those details matter. You sense when something is being left out, and that omission feels louder than any confession. Let's pause for a gentle joke, because otherwise this starts to feel like gemstone therapy hour. Imagine being told, "Don't worry, it's only absorbed some blood," as if that's a reassuring metric. Royal reassurance has always been a bit tone-deaf. Certain stones gain reputations that outlast entire dynasties. Sapphires are sometimes seen as calming, protective, safe. Rubies and dark garnets less so. Emeralds sit somewhere in between, associated with vision and truth, which sounds nice until you remember that truth is often what gets people into trouble. You choose carefully, not based on fashion, but on emotional survivability. What won't follow you home? What won't show up in your dreams? Sleep, again, becomes the testing ground. You wear a piece once, feel unsettled afterward, and that's enough. You don't need a second trial. Queens rarely did. If something disrupted your inner balance, it was gone. The court might roll its eyes privately, but they comply publicly. Your comfort is stability. Your stability is everyone's problem. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about whether these fears were reinforced by later storytelling. Writers eager to dramatize royal lives by turning jewelry into villains. Historians still argue whether the stones were blamed unfairly for emotional states caused by isolation, pressure, and loss. But that debate doesn't erase the lived experience. When you feel worse wearing a jewel, you don't need an academic consensus. You need relief. Over time, you begin to curate not just a collection, but a boundary. Some pieces stay locked away because they feel crowded with other lives. Others feel quiet, almost empty, and those are the ones you trust. It's not that you believe the stones are alive, it's that you believe you are, and you're tired of carrying other people's endings on your skin. As you close the box on one particularly infamous gem, you feel a small, guilty sense of peace. The stone doesn't protest, it just sits there, red and perfect, and full of stories you're choosing not to inherit. And for once that feels like power. You learn early that fear doesn't always sound like fear. Sometimes it sounds like advice. gentle, reasonable, perfectly timed advice delivered by women who have survived just long enough to know what not to touch. These are the warnings that never make it into letters or ledgers, the ones passed hand to hand like contraband. A mother adjusts her daughter's veil and murmurs something about a necklace that never settles well. A retiring queen kisses your cheek and suggests, very casually, that you might prefer other earrings for your first public appearance. No one says why. They don't need to, you understand. There's a mainstream historical fact that frames this pattern. Royal women were often the primary custodians of jewel collections, especially items worn intimately on the body. While treasurers catalogued value, queens catalogued experience. They knew which pieces pinched, which caused rashes, which seemed to coincide with miscarriages or migraines. This knowledge wasn't formal, but it was persistent, and it travelled along family lines more reliably than written records ever could. You start to recognize that heirlooms don't arrive as gifts so much as obligations. A jewel given to you by your mother-in-law isn't just a token of acceptance, it's a test. Do you wear it publicly? Do you decline it politely? Do you pretend it doesn't exist? Each option carries risk. And layered beneath that social calculus is the unspoken question, why is she giving this to me now? Sometimes the answer is generosity, sometimes it's relief. Here's a quirky tidbit that survives in court gossip more than history books. Certain pieces were known as one-wear jewels. They were acceptable for a single major appearance, often a wedding or coronation, but never again. Wearing them twice was thought to tempt fate, like rereading a goodbye letter. You don't ask who decided this rule, you just follow it because everyone else does. And because no one can quite remember a second wearing that ended well. Historians still argue whether these warnings were based on superstition or on a pattern of coincidence amplified by grief. If 3 queens wore the same brooch during their first pregnancy and all 3 miscarried, does the brooch deserve blame? Statistically, maybe not. Emotionally, absolutely. You live in the emotional world, not the statistical one. And in that world, repetition equals meaning. These cautions become especially potent around moments of transition. Weddings, births, funerals, coronations, times when your identity shifts and your vulnerability spikes. You notice how older women in the family suddenly become very interested in what you're wearing at these moments. Their concern isn't aesthetic, it's protective, or at least it wants to be. They've seen what happens when symbolism collides with biology and politics. They've paid attention. Let's slide in a light joke before the tension gets too regal. Imagine a grandmother whispering, "That necklace is bad luck," and then immediately asking why you're not wearing it. Royal families have always excelled at mixed messages. There's also the uncomfortable reality that some warnings were strategic. A jewel associated with a rival branch of the family might be labelled unlucky to keep it from gaining visibility. Superstition becomes a polite cover for power plays. You sense this sometimes, the way a warning feels rehearsed, the way the concern doesn't quite reach the eyes. Still you listen, because even a manipulative warning can save you from something worse. In royal life, motives matter less than outcomes. You begin to accumulate your own list, not written, not spoken aloud, but deeply memorized. This ring feels wrong after sunset. Those earrings make your ears burn. That necklace gives you a sense of pressure, like a hand resting where it shouldn't. You don't need proof, you need consistency. And when you pass this list on years later, you do it the same way it was passed to you, quietly, kindly, without drama. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about whether these female-to-female transmissions of knowledge were a form of resistance within patriarchal systems. Historians still argue whether these whispered warnings allowed women to exert subtle control over their own bodies, in environments that otherwise denied them agency. If that's true, then avoiding certain jewels wasn't fear, it was strategy. Self-preservation disguised as superstition. You notice how men rarely interfere in these decisions. They might scoff privately, but publicly they defer. Jewel choices are women's matters and therefore safely ignored. That dismissal gives you space. Space to refuse without explanation. Space to comply selectively. Space to build a private rulebook that keeps you functional in a system that profits from your fragility. As this section settles, you find yourself repeating the cycle. A younger woman stands before you, uncertain, adjusting a piece you recognize instantly. You don't dramatize, you don't frighten her. You just say, "That one doesn't always wear kindly. You might try something else." And when relief flashes across her face, you know the tradition has survived another generation. Some jewels don't just carry bad vibes, they leave paperwork. You can trace their damage through abdication documents, annulment records, and suddenly revised lines of succession. These are the diamonds everyone pretends not to notice until it's far too late. You encounter them the way you encounter storms on the horizon, beautiful from a distance, catastrophic up close, and once you learn their names you never quite forget them. There is a mainstream historical fact that gives these diamonds their weight. Several famous royal diamonds became entangled with political crises, marital collapse, and public scandal. They were worn during pivotal moments, weddings that unraveled, coronations that preceded rebellion, public appearances that sparked outrage. The stones themselves didn't cause these events, of course, but they became visual shorthand for them. When people remembered the fall, they remembered the jewel, and memory, once fused, is stubborn. You start to understand that diamonds, despite their reputation for durability, are emotionally fragile symbols. They promise permanence in a world where nothing is permanent. That promise alone sets them up for failure. When a marriage collapses or a dynasty falters, the diamond becomes a liar in hindsight. And liars make people angry, especially when they glitter. Here's a quirky tidbit that floats through royal rumor like a persistent draft. Some courts believe diamonds amplified intent. Wear one in love, and it strengthens affection. Wear one in ambition, and it sharpens ruthlessness. Wear one while lying, and well, it remembers. This belief likely grew out of the diamond's association with clarity and truth. Clear stone, clear fate. When fate turned murky, the stone took the blame. Historians still argue whether certain diamonds became scapegoats for broader social changes that queens had no control over. A failing marriage could be blamed on a jewel rather than incompatible politics or personal misery. A controversial abdication could be softened by attaching misfortune to an object instead of a system. You see how convenient that is. Blaming a diamond preserves the illusion that the institution itself is sound. You feel this pressure acutely because as queen, you are expected to embody stability even when everything beneath you is shifting. Wearing a diamond associated with a previous collapse feels like tempting narrative fate. If something goes wrong during your reign, people won't say, "History repeated itself." They'll say, "She wore that diamond." And suddenly your personal misstep becomes part of a very shiny legend. Let's lighten the mood briefly. Imagine being told a diamond ruined 3 dynasties but looks incredible under candlelight. Royal jewelers had a gift for optimism. You notice that these problematic diamonds are rarely destroyed or sold. Instead, they're repurposed, reset into smaller pieces, hidden in tiaras that only appear once a decade, displayed behind glass with neutral descriptions like historical significance. It's a way of acknowledging their power without inviting it too close. You can admire from a distance. Distance, you've learned, is safety. There's also a gendered layer here that historians love to dissect. Diamonds associated with male rulers are framed as symbols of conquest. Diamonds associated with queens are framed as omens. Historians still argue whether this reflects misogyny or narrative laziness, but the effect is the same. Women inherit the blame, and the jewels inherit the myth. You inherit both. As you move through your collection, you begin to feel the weight of precedent more than the weight of the stones. You don't need to test every diamond yourself. History has already done that loudly. You choose the quiet ones, the ones that haven't been photographed at the moment everything went wrong, the ones without nicknames that include words like doom, weeping, or last. By the end of this section, you've learned a crucial survival skill. It's not the jewel itself you fear, but the story attached to it. Diamonds don't ruin dynasties, stories do. And once a story hardens around a stone, no amount of sparkle can soften it again. You wouldn't expect pearls to frighten anyone. They're soft-spoken jewels, the ones people describe with words like elegant, restrained, appropriate. And yet, as you spend more time listening than speaking, as queens learn to do, you realize pearls carry a reputation that makes people uneasy in a very specific, very quiet way. No one calls them dangerous, they call them sad. And sadness in royal life is never just an emotion, it's a forecast. There's a mainstream historical fact that anchors this association firmly in tradition. Pearls were widely linked to mourning and widowhood in European courts from the medieval period onward. Queens wore them during periods of grief, often layered against black fabric, their pale sheen catching light in somber halls. Over time, this visual pairing became so ingrained that pearls stopped symbolizing purity and started symbolizing loss. You don't need a curse when a jewel already looks like a tear. You feel this shift immediately when pearls are brought out. The atmosphere changes, voices soften, movements slow. Someone always comments on how appropriate they are, which in court language usually means emotionally loaded. You understand why brides hesitated, why reigning queens avoided them during hopeful occasions. Wearing pearls while trying to project joy felt like tempting fate to correct you. Here's a quirky tidbit that circulates in whispered lore. Some believed pearls were formed from the tears of the sea, crystallized grief, hardened into beauty. It's poetic, yes, but also deeply unhelpful if you're trying to reassure yourself before a wedding or a public announcement. You imagine fastening a strand of grief around your throat and hoping for the best. It's hard to unthink that once someone has said it out loud. Historians still argue whether the pearl-tear connection was universal or culturally reinforced through art and literature. Portraits of widowed queens wearing pearls certainly didn't help. Once painted, the association became permanent. You look at those images now and feel the weight of hindsight pressing backward through time. The pearl doesn't just reflect light, it reflects memory. You notice how often pearls appear at funerals and how rarely at celebrations meant to promise continuity. Births, coronations of young queens, marriages meant to secure alliances. When pearls do appear at such moments, people comment. They always comment. An interesting choice, they say, which is never neutral. It's a polite way of asking whether you're inviting sorrow in advance. Let's pause for a light joke before this turns into a jewelry-induced therapy session. Imagine being told you look radiant while wearing pearls and wondering if that radiance is meant to be posthumous. Royal compliments come with fine print. There's also the physical quality of pearls that unsettle people. Unlike stones cut from rock, pearls come from living creatures. They're formed through irritation, an intruder wrapped slowly in layers until it becomes something smooth enough to tolerate. That origin story felt uncomfortably close to royal life. You are, after all, often an intruder wrapped in protocol until your edges soften. The metaphor lands whether you want it to or not. You start to hear stories, never officially confirmed, of queens who wore pearls during pregnancies that ended badly, or before announcements that never came. Correlation becomes narrative. Narrative becomes warning. You don't need statistical significance when you have pattern recognition fueled by fear. And fear, in palaces, is a shared language. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about whether pearls were avoided because of superstition or because of optics. Historians still argue whether queens feared actual misfortune or simply feared looking mournful when they were expected to look hopeful. The answer, inconveniently, is probably both. In royal life, image and belief feed each other until they're indistinguishable. You notice how pearl jewelry often gets relegated to older queens, dowagers, women whose reproductive and political risks are perceived as settled. It's not cruelty, it's symbolism. Pearls mark a phase of life where sorrow is acknowledged rather than resisted. For a young queen trying to project continuity, that symbolism feels premature, even threatening. So you make choices. You wear pearls, sparingly, carefully, strategically. You avoid them during moments meant to promise the future. You save them for remembrance, for quiet ceremonies, for times when acknowledging grief feels safer than pretending it doesn't exist. This isn't fear, you tell yourself, it's literacy. You've learned to read what jewels say even when you stay silent. By the time you close the pearl box, you feel oddly relieved, not because pearls are evil, they're not, but because you've learned that even the gentlest objects can carry expectations you don't want to fulfill. And in a life where expectations can become destiny, that awareness is everything. Foreign jewels make people nervous in a way that domestic ones rarely do. You can feel it the moment they enter the room, wrapped in unfamiliar settings, cut in styles that don't quite match local taste. They're beautiful, undeniably so, but beauty doesn't cancel suspicion. In a palace, anything foreign arrives already burdened with questions. Who owned this before? Under what circumstances did it change hands? And more importantly, what did it cost, really? There's a mainstream historical fact that explains this unease without requiring superstition at all. Many royal jewels entered collections through conquest, colonization, or forced treaties. They weren't exchanged as equals, they were extracted. Gems taken from defeated courts, dismantled regalia from fallen rulers, offerings made under pressure, and later reframed as gifts. You know this, even if no one says it outright, because the paperwork exists. Inventories spike after wars. Jewel chests get heavier when borders expand. You begin to notice how these foreign pieces are discussed differently. People describe their craftsmanship rather than their beauty, their origin rather than their effect. It comes from the East, someone says, as if direction alone explains the tension. There's admiration there, yes, but also distance, a sense that the jewel doesn't quite belong and might never fully settle. In royal thinking, belonging matters. Objects that don't belong are unpredictable. Here's a quirky tidbit that survives in fringe court law. Some queens believed foreign jewels carried the will of the land they came from. Not curses exactly, but intentions. A gem taken from a conquered kingdom might still want its old world back. Wearing it, according to this belief, could invite unrest, rebellion, or personal misfortune as that unresolved history tried to reassert itself. It's a poetic idea and also a very convenient way to avoid wearing politically awkward pieces. Historians still argue whether this fear was rooted in genuine belief or in xenophobia dressed up as mysticism, probably both. You live in an era where foreignness itself is framed as destabilizing. New languages, new customs, new alliances, all potential threats. A jewel from elsewhere becomes a symbol of that unease. When something goes wrong, it's easy to point to the unfamiliar and say, there. You feel this especially during public appearances. Wearing a foreign jewel sends a message whether you intend it to or not. It can be read as dominance, we took this, or as vulnerability, we are displaying what we cannot fully control. Neither interpretation is entirely comfortable. You realize that sometimes queens avoided these jewels not because they feared misfortune, but because they feared interpretation. In court, interpretation is everything. Let's lighten the mood briefly. Imagine being told this necklace represents international power and thinking, great, does it come with international consequences too? Because it always does. There's also the issue of ritual compatibility. Different cultures imbued jewels with different meanings, protective symbols, religious significance, astrological timing. When these pieces crossed borders, their original context often came with them, half understood and deeply unsettling. You might be wearing a gem once consecrated in a ceremony you don't recognize, dedicated to beliefs you don't share. Even if you're not religiously inclined, that mismatch feels itchy, like wearing someone else's wedding ring. You hear stories of queens who fell ill after wearing newly acquired foreign jewels, and whether or not those stories are true almost doesn't matter. They circulate, they settle. They become cautionary tales told with lowered voices and meaningful pauses. Historians still argue whether these accounts reflect real anxieties about empire and guilt, projected onto objects that made those anxieties tangible. Over time, you notice a pattern. Foreign jewels are displayed more than they are worn. They appear in cabinets, exhibitions, diplomatic photographs. They're proof of reach, not intimacy. When it comes to pieces that actually touch your skin, you choose familiarity. Not because it's safer in any objective sense, but because it feels quieter. And quiet is rare currency in your life. As you close the drawer on a particularly magnificent foreign necklace, you don't feel rejection, you feel restraint. You're not denying its beauty or its value, you're acknowledging that some histories are too loud to wear comfortably, and in a role where your body is already a battlefield of symbols, choosing what not to carry can be the most deliberate act of all. You start to notice something odd once you've watched enough ceremonies from the inside. The most important jewels are often the least visible. Not because they're hidden away in shame, but because they're avoided with intention. These are the pieces everyone knows exist, everyone expects to see, and yet, somehow, you don't. They hover at the edge of tradition, officially part of the regalia, unofficially sidelined. And no one ever explains why. There's a mainstream historical fact that gives this pattern structure. Royal coronation sets were rarely fixed. Despite what portraits suggest, monarchs frequently selected from multiple crowns, scepters, and ornaments rather than using a single, immutable set. Records show substitutions, omissions, and quiet revisions across reigns. When a particular piece keeps getting skipped, it's not oversight. It's consensus. You feel the weight of that consensus when the coronation planning begins. Officials speak in careful language. Traditionally worn, they say, not must be worn. Someone mentions logistics, someone else mentions comfort. No one says that one has a bad track record, but everyone seems to know. You sense a collective exhale when an alternative is chosen. Relief passes through the room like a draft. Here's a quirky tidbit that circulates in ceremonial lore. Some regalia were believed to be single-purpose objects. Safe for one monarch, disastrous for another. A crown that suited a conquering king might be disastrous for a conciliatory queen. The idea wasn't that the object was cursed universally, but that it demanded a specific temperament. Wear it with the wrong energy and it would push back. It's an oddly personalized way to fear an object, and a very human one. Historians still argue whether these decisions were driven by superstition or by political optics. A crown associated with authoritarian rule might be avoided by a monarch trying to project reform. A jewel linked to military expansion might be sidelined during fragile peace. Over time, symbolism hardens into instinct. You don't need to articulate the reasoning anymore, you just know what feels wrong. You notice that queens, in particular, are encouraged toward moderation. Lighter crowns, smaller scepters, fewer layers of regalia. Officially, this is about elegance. Unofficially, it's about risk. A queen already disrupts expectations by existing in power. Adding a controversial jewel on top of that feels like stacking instability. You're advised, gently, persistently, to choose pieces that reassure rather than provoke. Let's slip in a light joke here. Imagine declining a centuries-old crown and saying, "It's not you, it's me," and meaning it sincerely. Royal breakups are always polite. Some pieces become so avoided that their absence becomes tradition in itself. New generations grow up assuming they were never worn. Only archivists and jewelers remember otherwise, and they rarely volunteer the information. The object remains immaculate and unused, like a sentence everyone agreed to stop finishing. There's also a physical reality that feeds the fear. Older regalia was often uncomfortable, unstable, or even dangerous to wear. Sharp edges, poor balance, settings that snagged hair or skin. If a queen fainted during a ceremony, and some did, the jewel involved took on a reputation instantly. No one wanted a repeat performance. Safety masqueraded as superstition, and superstition protected safety. A neat little loop. Historians still argue whether queens actively resisted certain coronation pieces or whether those decisions were made for them by advisors eager to avoid scandal. The truth probably sits in the middle. You assert preference where you can. Others anticipate your fear and remove the option before you have to refuse it. Either way, the result is the same. A jewel that stays in its case. As the ceremony approaches, you realize something quietly empowering. Tradition isn't as rigid as it pretends to be. It adapts to fear, absorbs it, and calls the result continuity. When you step forward wearing a carefully chosen set, one that omits certain legendary pieces, you don't feel diminished. You feel lighter. And for a moment, as the crown settles without protest, you allow yourself to believe that avoidance can be a form of wisdom. By the time astrologers enter the conversation, fear has learned to dress itself as expertise. You don't seek them out openly, no reigning queen ever does, but they find you anyway, orbiting the court like tolerated ghosts. They arrive with charts, tables, and that unsettling confidence of people who believe the universe has already decided things for you. And when they start talking about jewels, you listen. Not because you fully believe, but because enough powerful people do. There's a mainstream historical fact anchoring this moment firmly in reality. Court astrologers were officially consulted in many European and Asian monarchies well into the early modern period. They advised on coronation dates, marriages, military campaigns, and yes, adornment. Jewelry mattered because it touched the body at critical moments, and astrology cared deeply about timing and contact. A stone worn at the wrong hour was considered not just unlucky, but actively destabilizing. You notice how carefully they phrase their warnings. They don't say, "Don't wear that." They say, "This stone resonates poorly with your nativity," or "Mars is not well aspected for rubies at the moment." It sounds technical enough to be unarguable. You nod, because nodding costs less than defiance, and because deep down you're already tired of tempting fate without backup. Here's a quirky tidbit that surfaces in fringe astrological manuals. Some stones were believed to wake up only under certain planetary alignments. A jewel that sat quietly for decades could suddenly become volatile if worn when Saturn crossed the wrong house. This meant a piece could be safe for one queen and disastrous for another, depending entirely on birth charts. Personalized fear, custom-fit anxiety, astrology was nothing if not thorough. Historians still argue whether queens genuinely believed in these cosmic rules or used them as a socially acceptable excuse to avoid unwanted duels. Astrology provided cover. You didn't have to accuse a crown of being cursed. You could simply say the stars advised against it. In a court obsessed with destiny, that explanation carried real weight. You start to notice patterns. Queens born under certain signs are gently steered away from specific gems, fire signs discouraged from rubies, water signs warned about pearls, remember those? Earth signs advised caution with heavy gold. It feels absurd until you remember how little control you actually have over your life. If the stars give you one small lever of choice, you pull it. Let's add a light joke before the constellations take over completely. Imagine blaming a bad day on Mercury and your necklace. It's not my fault, I'm retrograding accessorily. Astrology also intersects neatly with gender expectations. Kings consult astrologers for wars. Queens consult them for weddings, births, and appearances. Historians still argue whether this division reflects belief or convenience, but the effect is clear. Your body becomes the site where cosmic risk is managed. Jewelry resting directly on that body becomes a variable to control. You're told stories of queens who ignored astrological advice and paid for it, not dramatically, not immediately, but subtly. Sleeplessness, irritability, a run of bad luck that no one can quite prove, but everyone remembers. Once a narrative like that takes hold, it's self-sustaining. You don't want to be the next example whispered about by candlelight. Over time, you develop a private hierarchy of trust. Some jewels feel astrologically neutral, safe defaults. Others are conditional, only worn at specific times under specific skies. A few are permanently retired, not because they're cursed, but because aligning stars, schedules, and survival instincts becomes too exhausting to manage. As you fold the astrologer's advice into your decision-making, you realize something quietly unsettling. Fear doesn't always come from ignorance. Sometimes it comes from too many explanations. Too many systems telling you what might go wrong if you choose incorrectly. In that noise, avoidance starts to feel like clarity. So you thank the astrologer, you smile, you choose the safer piece. And as the stars continue doing whatever they were going to do anyway, you sleep a little easier, believing you've at least listened. Every so often, a queen decides she's had enough of warnings, enough of charts, whispers, and carefully worded suggestions. You can feel the moment it happens, the shift from caution to curiosity, from inherited fear to personal defiance. These are the queens who look at a forbidden jewel and think, no, I'll decide. And for a brief, intoxicating moment, that choice feels like freedom. There is a mainstream historical fact that grounds this impulse in reality. Some queens deliberately revived or prominently wore jewels their predecessors had avoided, often as statements of authority or continuity. Jewelry, after all, is visual rhetoric. To wear a contested piece is to announce confidence, even dominance. You don't just inherit the crown, you reclaim its symbols, at least that's the theory. You feel the appeal immediately. If a jewel has been sidelined because of fear, wearing it becomes an act of courage or rebellion, depending on who's watching. It says you're not bound by other people's anxieties, that you're stronger, more rational, more modern. And in courts always straining toward the future, modernity is seductive. Here's a quirky tidbit that circulates in half-embarrassed memoirs. Some queens reportedly wore forbidden jewels in private first, like test-driving superstition, a necklace at a small dinner, a ring during a quiet walk. When nothing terrible happened, confidence grew. The jewel graduated to public appearances. It felt scientific, controlled, reasonable, and just a little bit thrilling. Historians still argue whether the misfortunes that followed these defiant choices were coincidence or confirmation bias. When a queen who flouted warnings later faced illness, scandal, or political loss, the jewel took the blame. It didn't matter that every reign includes hardship. The narrative had already been written. She tempted fate. Once that story exists, every setback feeds it. You begin to notice how subtle the price often is. Not sudden death or dramatic collapse, those are too obvious, but erosion, a run of bad press, a marriage that cools, allies who grow distant. It's the kind of slow unravelling that's hard to pin on any one cause, which makes the jewel a convenient focal point. People want symbols. They want a moment when things turned. The forbidden jewel provides one. Let's add a light joke here, because otherwise this starts sounding like a gemstone soap opera. Imagine historians centuries later arguing whether your downfall was caused by geopolitics or that one necklace you wore twice. Spoiler alert, they'll pick the necklace. There's also the emotional cost. When you defy tradition and something goes wrong, even something unrelated, you feel the weight of what if. Would this have happened anyway? Probably. Does that stop you from replaying the decision in your head at 3 a.m? Absolutely not. Fear, once dismissed, comes back louder if it feels vindicated. Historians still argue whether these queens were genuinely more rational or simply more isolated. Defiance can be lonely. When you reject inherited wisdom, you lose a layer of communal protection. No one says, "We warned her," to be cruel. They say it to reassure themselves that the system still works. And suddenly you're not just unlucky, you're irresponsible. You notice that even defiant queens often retreat quietly. The jewel disappears from rotation, without comment, no announcement, no apology, just absence. The court understands, they always do. The story closes itself, satisfied. As this section draws to a close, you're left with a complicated truth. Defiance doesn't cancel fear, it rearranges it. Wearing a forbidden jewel might feel powerful in the moment, but power in isolation is brittle. And in a world where symbolism outlives intention, sometimes the bravest choice isn't to prove the warnings wrong. It's to stop needing to test them at all. By this point, you've learned that feared jewels are rarely destroyed. Destruction would imply certainty, and certainty is dangerous in a palace. Instead, these pieces vanish politely. They slip out of circulation, retreating into velvet-lined drawers and steel-reinforced rooms where time moves differently. You don't say they're hidden. You say they're kept. Language matters when you're dealing with objects that still make people nervous. There's a mainstream historical fact that explains this behavior with almost boring practicality. Royal jewels represent immense financial and diplomatic value. Even a stone believed to be unlucky is still an asset, still leverage, still history crystallized into something portable. Destroying it would be irrational. Selling it might be offensive. So you lock it away. You preserve the value while neutralizing the risk, or at least convincing yourself you have. You feel the gravity of these vaults the first time you enter one. The air is cooler. The silence is heavier. Each drawer slides open with ceremonial slowness, revealing pieces that haven't touched skin in decades. Some are instantly familiar. Others surprise you. You didn't know that was still here. The feared jewels aren't labelled as such. They're catalogued neutrally, but you can sense which ones they are by how long the keeper hesitates before opening the case. Here's a quirky tidbit that lives in archival footnotes and staff gossip. Certain jewels were reportedly wrapped in extra layers or stored separately, not for protection, but for containment, as if distance itself could dull influence. One particularly infamous piece might be kept in its own box, in its own drawer, in its own locked cabinet. Overkill? Maybe. Comforting? Absolutely. Historians still argue whether this sequestration reflects genuine belief in danger or simply institutional caution. Vaults are places where anxiety gets organized. You can't control what people believe, but you can control where objects are allowed to go. Once a jewel stops appearing in public, its power changes. It becomes legend rather than presence. And legends, while frightening, are at least predictable. You also notice how these hidden jewels acquire a strange secondary status. They're talked about more once they're unseen. Is it still there? Someone asks casually. I heard no one's worn it since... And the sentence trails off. The absence becomes louder than any appearance ever was. The jewel's imagined influence grows precisely because it's not tested. Uncertainty keeps it alive. Let's slide in a light joke here, because otherwise this is starting to feel like a horror movie set in a jewelry box. Imagine being told, "Don't worry, it's triple locked," as if the jewel might escape on its own. There's also a personal dimension to this hiding. When you choose not to wear a feared jewel, you're not just protecting yourself, you're protecting the narrative of your reign. You don't want future historians drawing lines between your misfortunes and a stone you could have avoided. Locking it away is preemptive damage control, silence as strategy. Historians still argue whether these vault-bound jewels functioned as symbolic scapegoats, absorbing blame simply by existing out of sight. When things went wrong, people could think, at least she didn't wear that one. Avoidance becomes proof of prudence. You don't need to be brave if you can be careful. Over time, the vault becomes a kind of memory palace. Each drawer holds not just objects, but decisions, moments when someone chose restraint over display. You run your fingers along the cool, metal edge of a case and feel oddly grateful. Not everything needs to be resolved. Some things just need to be contained. As you leave the vault, the door closing with a soft, final click, you realize something quietly reassuring. Feared jewels lose power when they lose proximity. Distance doesn't erase history, but it gives you room to breathe. And in a life lived under constant symbolism, that breathing room is priceless. Religion complicates everything because once belief enters the room, logic politely excuses itself. You feel this most strongly with jewels that come preloaded with moral meaning. These aren't just objects anymore, they're statements about virtue, temptation, and consequence. You don't wear them lightly because once a jewel is tied to sin, even symbolically, it becomes a test you never agreed to take. There's a mainstream historical fact that frames this fear clearly. Many royal jewels were originally church property, religious offerings, or were commissioned with overtly spiritual symbolism. Crosses set with gems, rings blessed during sacraments, crowns modelled after sacred relics. When these pieces moved from altar to body, the transition wasn't always comfortable. Wearing something meant for God felt risky, especially if your own moral life was under constant scrutiny. You notice how certain jewels draw comments not about beauty, but about worthiness. It suits you, someone says, or more pointedly, it's a heavy responsibility. Responsibility in this context means judgment. If you wear a jewel associated with holiness and then make a mistake, political, personal, or painfully human, the contrast becomes ammunition. The jewel doesn't protect you, it highlights the gap. Here's a quirky tidbit that survives in religious court law. Some queens believed jewels connected to sacred spaces could punish improper wearers, not violently, but through discomfort, a persistent headache, a sense of unease, a run of guilt-laced dreams. It's the spiritual cousin of the bad crown phenomenon, just wrapped in incense instead of velvet. Historians still argue whether these fears reflect sincere piety or anxiety amplified by public morality. Queens lived under moral microscopes. Every choice was interpreted. Wearing a jewel associated with virtue meant agreeing to embody it perfectly. That's a dangerous contract. You're human. You will fail. Why invite an object that makes failure look like sacrilege? You also notice how jewels associated with excess, huge stones, elaborate settings, trigger religious discomfort even when not explicitly sacred. Modesty was preached loudly and practiced selectively, but queens were expected to perform it convincingly. A jewel deemed too much could be framed as pride. Pride, everyone agreed, came before a fall. The jewel didn't cause the fall, it announced it in advance. Let's slip in a light joke here, because otherwise we're one sermon away from a monastery. Imagine being told, that necklace is beautiful, but God is watching. Royal accessorizing was never casual. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about whether religious anxiety genuinely influenced jewel choices or whether it served as moral cover for political restraint. Historians still argue whether queens avoided certain jewels because of faith or because faith provided an unchallengeable excuse. Either way, the effect was the same. Some pieces stayed unworn, their holiness intact, and their danger undisturbed. As this section settles, you realize that religion didn't need to declare a jewel cursed to make it frightening. All it had to do was make the stakes eternal. And eternity is a lot to carry around your neck. You might think modernity would loosen these fears, that electricity and press offices and carefully worded statements would finally drain the magic out of jewels. But what you discover instead is something quieter and stranger. The superstitions don't disappear, they adapt. They slip into the background dressed up as preference, protocol, or personal taste. And modern queens, who are very aware of cameras, commentary, and consequence, continue to avoid certain jewels with the same careful grace their predecessors mastered centuries ago. There's a mainstream historical fact that grounds this continuity. Contemporary royal jewel collections still include pieces that are rarely, if ever, worn despite their immense value and historical importance. These absences aren't accidental. They're noted by journalists, historians, and jewel watchers who track appearances with forensic attention. When a particular tiara or necklace keeps failing to show up decade after decade, people notice. And when asked, the answers are always vague. You feel this modern restraint most clearly in public appearances. Every outfit is planned, discussed, revised. Jewelry choices are scrutinized not just for beauty, but for message. You're told a piece is too heavy for the moment, or doesn't photograph well, or belongs to a different era. All of these explanations may be true, and still not the whole truth, because underneath them is a familiar calculation. What has happened the last few times this was worn? Here's a quirky tidbit that circulates among royal correspondents rather than courtiers. Some modern queens reportedly keep informal do-not-wear lists. Not official, not written, but deeply remembered. A tiara worn during a divorce announcement. Earrings associated with a public backlash. A necklace linked, however unfairly, to a year of relentless bad press. The superstition hasn't vanished, it's just been rebranded as brand management. Historians still argue whether these modern avoidances are conscious superstition or subconscious pattern avoidance. When you're under constant observation, your brain becomes exquisitely sensitive to correlation. If a jewel coincides with criticism once, you note it. Twice, you hesitate. 3 times, it's gone. You don't need to believe it's cursed to decide it's not worth the risk. You also notice how modern queens talk about jewelry in interviews. They emphasize sentiment, gift givers, anniversaries. They rarely emphasize history unless it's reassuring. A piece belonged to a beloved grandmother sounds safe. A piece was last worn during a national crisis does not. Language smooths the fear, but it doesn't erase it. Let's slip in a light joke here, because even modern royalty needs one. Imagine saying, "I just don't vibe with that tiara," and watching an entire press office translate it into something respectable. Vibes have always mattered, we just pretend they're new. There's also a generational aspect. Younger royals inherit not just jewels, but narratives about them. Even if the original fear is forgotten, the avoidance remains. "That one doesn't really come out," someone says, and that's enough. You don't need a reason if tradition has already done the deciding for you. This is how superstition survives rational eras, by becoming habit instead of belief. Historians still argue whether media scrutiny has replaced superstition as the primary driver of jewel avoidance. After all, a single photograph can cement an association forever. Wear a jewel during an unpopular event, and it becomes visually inseparable from that moment. The jewel doesn't need mystical power when the internet has a long memory. In some ways, that's more frightening. You also sense a quieter, more personal layer. Modern queens may not publicly believe in curses, but they still live in bodies shaped by stress, pressure, and symbolic weight. If a particular piece makes you feel tense, exposed, or uneasy, why wear it? Comfort becomes a valid justification, and comfort, once again, masquerades as taste. As this section draws toward its close, you realize something both comforting and unsettling. Progress hasn't eliminated fear, it's just taught it to whisper. The jewels still wait, some shine under lights, others remain in boxes untouched. Their stories too complicated, too noisy, too heavy for a world that already demands so much restraint. You don't announce your avoidance. You don't explain it. You simply choose differently. And in that quiet choice, you're standing in a very long line of queens who learned that survival sometimes looks like simplicity. By now, you've probably noticed that no one ever fully agrees on why these fears exist. That uncertainty is part of their strength. Every generation inherits not just jewels, but arguments, polite, persistent disagreements about cause and meaning. You sit at the far end of a long table where scholars, courtiers, and chroniclers have been quietly debating for centuries, and the uncomfortable truth is this: none of them can prove you wrong for being cautious. There is a mainstream historical fact that keeps this debate alive. Written records about jewel use are inconsistent, fragmented, and often contradictory. One source praises a stone as protective, another condemns it as disastrous. A jewel worn during a peaceful reign is later blamed for chaos under a different monarch. History doesn't offer clean data. It offers anecdotes, portraits, inventories, and letters written by people with motives. And motives always blur evidence. You feel this ambiguity when historians talk past each other. One argues coincidence, random misfortune, retroactively assigned meaning. Another argues propaganda, stories shaped to excuse failure or discredit rivals. A third leans into belief itself, suggesting that fear becomes real through behavior. If a queen avoids a jewel, others notice. If she wears it and hesitates, they sense it. Anxiety alters posture, expression, confidence. And confidence, as you've learned, is half the crown. Here's a quirky tidbit from academic margins rather than palaces. Some scholars suggest feared jewels functioned as psychological pressure valves. By blaming objects, courts reduced personal blame. A queen didn't fail, the jewel was unlucky. A reign didn't unravel, fate intervened. It's a surprisingly compassionate theory. Objects absorb guilt so people can keep functioning. Whether or not it's true, it explains why the stories persist. Historians still argue whether superstition followed misfortune or preceded it. Did a jewel become feared because bad things happened, or did fear change how those events were perceived? You live inside that question. If you're warned against a piece and later struggle, the warning feels prophetic. If you struggle first and then search for meaning, the jewel becomes a suspect. Either way, the narrative tightens around you. Let's add a light joke here, because otherwise we're drifting into a late-night seminar. Imagine being the jewel, listening to humans argue for centuries about whether you ruined their lives. I just sat there, the diamond thinks. They did the rest. There's also the problem of selective memory. Successes fade, disasters linger. If a queen wears a jewel and nothing happens, no one writes it down. If she wears it and something goes wrong, even years later, it becomes part of the jewel's file. Historians still argue whether this bias explains most so-called cursed objects. You suspect it explains more than anyone wants to admit. And yet, this is where certainty slips again. You can't dismiss lived experience entirely. Queens reported feeling different wearing certain pieces, heavier, tenser, watched. Whether that sensation came from belief, design, or coincidence hardly matters. If something alters how you move through the world, it alters outcomes. Behavior shapes history as much as belief does. As you weigh these arguments, you realize the debate itself is part of the inheritance. There's no final verdict, because a final verdict would strip the jewels of their power to warn, to caution, to slow you down. Ambiguity keeps you alert. It keeps you choosing rather than defaulting. And in a system that thrives on inertia, that's not nothing. By the end of this section, you're no closer to certainty, but you're closer to understanding. Fear doesn't need proof to be functional. It just needs to persist long enough to influence behavior. And royal history, built on repetition and symbolism, gives it plenty of time. By the time you reach the end of this long inheritance, you realize the fear was never really about jewels at all. It was about power, how close you could hold it without letting it bruise you. Jewels just happened to be the most visible, most intimate way that power touched the body. They rested on skin pressed against pulse points, hovered near the throat and temples. They didn't just symbolize authority, they entered it. There is a mainstream historical fact that ties everything together quietly but firmly. Royal women lived with an unusually high awareness of risk. Childbirth, illness, political betrayal, public judgment, none of these were abstract threats, they were daily possibilities. In that environment, pattern recognition became survival instinct. If a jewel coincided with danger often enough, it stopped being decoration and started being a warning sign. You see now how beauty itself became suspicious. Anything too perfect, too radiant, too loaded with expectation felt like it might demand payment later. A jewel promised permanence in lives defined by uncertainty, and promises, as you've learned, are rarely free. Queens feared jewels not because they were irrational, but because they were attentive. They noticed how often power extracted a cost. Here's a quirky tidbit that feels almost tender in hindsight. Some queens reportedly kept a single, unremarkable piece they wore during moments of genuine calm. A simple ring, a modest pendant, not valuable, not ceremonial, just safe. In collections bursting with brilliance, the most trusted object was often the quietest one. That alone tells you everything. Historians still argue whether royal jewel fear was superstition, strategy, or storytelling layered over coincidence. But sitting where you are now, that distinction feels less important. Fear doesn't need to be correct to be useful. It only needs to help you survive long enough to matter. And in royal life, longevity was its own form of victory. You think back to all the avoided pieces, the crowns left in cases, the necklaces never fastened, the stones admired but never worn. None of them shattered history by being ignored. Empires rose and fell anyway. What changed was the body carrying the crown, the mind navigating the days. Avoidance didn't weaken power. Sometimes it stabilized it. You also see how deeply human this all is. Anyone who's ever avoided a song tied to heartbreak, a place tied to loss, or a color worn on a bad day understands this instinct immediately. queens just lived it at a louder volume with higher stakes and better lighting. Their fear wasn't mystical, it was recognizable. And so as you imagine closing the final jewel box, the room feels calmer than it did at the beginning. Not because the dangers are gone, but because you've learned how to coexist with them. You don't need to prove anything to these objects. You don't need to test fate. You can choose lightness. You can choose quiet. Now the pace slows, the stories soften at the edges, the jewels return to stillness, resting where they've always rested, their power reduced to memory and reflection. You breathe more evenly. The crown is no longer watching. The mirrors dim. And the long line of queens before you finally falls silent, their warnings delivered, their fears passed on gently, without urgency. Now dim the lights a little more. Let the room fade into that comfortable half-dark where thoughts loosen their grip. The hum in the background steadies, your breathing follows, and the weight of gold and history slips away, leaving only calm, unguarded quiet.